Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots. I'm James Heale and I'm joined today by Isabel Hardman and Michael Simmons. Now, yesterday, Isabel, we had the publication of the second module of Baroness Hallett's COVID inquiry. There are 10 overall, so excitingly we're going to carry this on for the next 2.5 years or so. But tell us about the sort of main findings from this report and whether we learnt anything new.
Yeah, so this was on the decision-making at the heart of government in the run-up to and during the pandemic. And look, I don't think we did learn anything particularly new. Most of it had come out either in news reports or evidence to the COVID inquiry. I think it confirmed, baked in what we already knew in terms of a culture of chaotic decision-making, a culture of fear that could sometimes be sexist, that Boris Johnson either appeared not to be in control of or quite happy to continue going in its toxic way. And a lack of seriousness in February 2020 about the approaching pandemic, which led the report to say that month was a lost month. So that's its findings in terms of the decision making. And I think there probably are things to learn for future governments about how to approach a pandemic from the report. However, as I'm sure Michael is itching to say, the headlines and the debate around the report have focused on its more contentious findings / conjecture. I think it's probably best to say.
Well, look, I brought my reality check mug along for this very purpose because I'll be honest, I think the report is a total disgrace. The only headline that anyone's going to take away from this is the finding that Baroness Hallett made that 23,000 deaths could have been prevented, apparently, if lockdown had been earlier. And she used a phrase that really made me lose my mind, which is modelling established. Modelling has never established anything. That's not what, modelling does. And this, I'm sorry to say, Baroness Hallett is obviously a great eminent legal mind, but it shows a lack of domain knowledge here. There was modelling on all sides. This 23,000 figure is based on something that Professor Neil Ferguson came up with. Back right at the time that happened, Simon Wood, who's a mathematician, did a piece for the Spectator picking that apart. He's also now published this academically, and Neil Ferguson has never refuted that. And sort of worse still, when the Spectator was doing its coverage at the time, picking apart these models, taking issue with them, as soon as we did it, the Science Media Centre or, press offices from various universities that were involved with this would be emailing us and they'd be on the phone saying, you're misrepresenting modelling. Modelling doesn't establish things. Modelling doesn't predict things. In a best case, modelling gives you, with reasonable assumptions, this might happen. In a worst case, it's guesswork. And I'm afraid what we've seen in this report is a £200 million I told you so. There was other modelling she could have used that said, actually, the first wave had peaked before the lockdown. And she's just taken one set of modelling because this is the finding she wants to make and use this phrase established. I find that completely gobsmacking. And actually, it's a disgrace to Boris Johnson because there are many criticisms you could, of course, make of him. But the only headline anyone will take from this is Boris killed 23,000 people.
And of course, Boris Johnson was the one who set up this COVID inquiry. I mean, Isabel, we've got a long way to go on this, and I think maybe it'd be fair to say that this module was perhaps one of the less useful ones in some ways than some of the others that might come out of it. But do you think there is now a case, given you are writing the book on public inquiries, to kind of revisit the 2005 Inquiries Act and fundamentally ask if inquiries are serving their proper purpose?
Thank you for the book plug, James. Yeah, I mean, I think there is an appetite within government to revisit the Act, but whether that appetite is something that's going to be carried through to any kind of legislative action in the next few years when they have quite a few other things on their plate, and inquiries do tend to end up rather at the bottom of government in trays, it is another matter. I think what this report shows is the fragility for inquiries of having authority. So I'm amazed that they picked that figure because it's, as journalists, we're like moths to flames with figures like that. Although that suggests that we then get killed, which we haven't been. We're not in that figure.
Not yet.
Not yet. That's report 7. But I just think that if you're going to put a big eye-catching claim like that into a report, It has to stand up, otherwise the whole report starts to lose authority very quickly. And because we're in this landscape where there are so many public inquiries, and because, as you say, the COVID inquiry has gone on for so long, has cost so much money, has had so many criticisms about being overly stakeholder driven, about having too broad a remit. That's not the inquiry's fault, actually, that's the terms of reference's fault. But anyway, it is already struggling to get its voice heard as a useful exercise in learning lessons for the future and in establishing what happened. And I don't think it's managed to do either of those things with this report. As you say, there are other reports. I think the one on children in the pandemic could be really important and really quite painful as well, and contain a lot of lessons for future disasters like this. But I think this one will be too easy for the people who could be making changes to the system to dismiss or forget. Either you have the sort of those on the Boris Johnson side, and he does not come out well from this. And I think if it were a better report, it would probably bake in the idea that he's unfit to return to public office. However, I don't think he's going to have that sort of concern from this report, because he could dismiss it saying, well, it's got a load of inept stuff in it. But if you're in the Labour government at the moment, you can do some pointing fingers at Tories, and then you have very little incentive to keep going with the really hard bit that happens after an inquiry, which is actually getting stuff done when no one's interested anymore.
And I think it's worth saying as well, you do have to take a staggering mental leap to take this report even remotely seriously, because forget the 23,000 number, which we could spend ages picking apart. Fundamentally, her finding is harder lockdown, quicker lockdown. But at the time, that obviously became the scientific consensus, and that's what she wants to play in. But at the time, when COVID was first appearing in February, March of 2020, that's not what scientists were saying. That's not what SAGE were saying, So if she's, for her to say, actually, we should have done this, it would have required the government to go, no, we need to ignore the scientific advice. They're all wrong, which presumably later on she's going to say you ignored the science when it came to Omicron and the later lockdowns. For me, that's just a huge mental jump.
In a different context, I saw you, Isabel, last night talking about a discussion on Times Radio, which was about sort of, it was about gender-related care, wasn't it? And the criticism that you had, I think is pretty fair, is that some doctors are often too quick to dismiss others' viewpoints as though there is enough settled view of what the science is. And actually, the debate around that, as Michael says, is a very live one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into that whole other can of worms in just this podcast, but I think it is worth just briefly summarising what happened, which was that Helen Joyce and Helen Webberley were debating about gender issues. Helen Webberley is head of Gender GP, which prescribes treatments to children who want to transition. Helen Joyce is a gender critical feminist. Helen Webberley took great exception to the fact that Helen Joyce was a statistician and not a medic, and spent, I'd say, the second half of this debate saying, we just don't have another medic here. Now, I find that fascinating, because the idea that doctors are the sole repository of wisdom and understanding about how a health service should work, about how treatment should be working, is, I think, has just been manifestly disproven by scandals such as contaminated blood, where you had in the early days, when you genuinely could have stopped tens of thousands of deaths, doctors complaining to newspapers that were reporting concerns about contaminated blood products, and actually getting some journalists quite severely censured for alarmist and inaccurate reporting, which, by the way, turned out to be entirely accurate and the tip of the iceberg in terms of the treatment calamity that followed. So actually, people who aren't doctors may act as an early warning system to doctors, rather than just being sort of irritations at God's heel.
It was really interesting, Michael. One of the things from this report as well was that obviously it talked about Boris Johnson. That's things that's going to grab all the figures. And on the media response today, it's obviously pictures of him, etc., those horrible COVID memories from early 2020. But also there were criticisms of the different decision-making throughout the rest of the United Kingdom. So the concern about Nicola Sturgeon is that she sort of took decisions without notes. Was that quite sort of closed circle? They weren't properly listening to advice. There was also things about power sharing at Stormont, and that affected the dynamics. I mean, would it be a mistake to just sort of see this as through one partisan lens? It seems like the whole system failed. And when we're talking now about different time periods, etc., you've also got to weigh up the sort of short term of March 2020 with the longer term effects as well.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And it's the point Isabel made earlier, that because she's put this 23,000 figure in the report that you can so pick apart. I mean, we've got graphs just showing how inaccurate all this modelling was. It sort of is going to give people license to discredit the whole report. But there is, as you say, important stuff there about devolution. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon is a very interesting one who I think towards the end of the pandemic did become, tried to become this serious figure for obvious political gain. But I mean, I can tell you firsthand, in my misspent youth, I worked for the Scottish Government right at the start of COVID as a statistician. And right in the early days, I think when no one realised how many years this was going to last, how serious it was, someone in my sort of wider department was taken off working on, I think they were working on census demography, to work in the First Minister's office for the express purpose of producing like a daily report on why Scotland was handling this all better than England. And that was the attitude that Nicola Sturgeon had, and probably sort of had throughout a lot of the pandemic. And the inquiry will hopefully point things like that out so that we learn that this kind of competitive devolution is bad for everyone in the long run. But, as Isabel said, people are just going to get hung up on the crazy modelling has established nonsense.
And I also think there's a real risk with all of these reports that we get hung up on the people who were there at the time. And I think it's right that they all face accountability for the decisions they made. And there's not enough accountability in public life, in my view. But it's still not that useful to future governments, because you end up saying, oh yeah, well, Nicola Sturgeon, she was a bad person, or she was annoying, or whatever.
It becomes their personality, right? Like Boris is chaotic, or Nicola
Boris
is secretive. Yeah.
I wouldn't be like that.
Yeah,
I wouldn't fail to do long-term planning for a pandemic, or I wouldn't take the word of my health secretary as gospel. Actually, the problem with these, I think the aftermath of the inquiries, rather than the report itself, is that we all get so fixated on the personalities.
Yes.
And Chilcot is the best example of that, where we were subjected to this sort of 3-hour-long rumination by Tony Blair after that report finally came out about how he'd made the right decision. He basically got the press to ask him any question they wanted to until they sort of died. And then, it was all about Tony Blair. Meanwhile, the government at the time was actually making choices about interventions that could have been quite usefully informed by a look at the processes and the systems in the report, as opposed to, oh yeah, but that was Blair, and we don't have a permatan, so we're okay.
But what went wrong in COVID, the not looking at the other side, the just thinking about the modelling and stopping the disease, and not thinking about, say, consequences for children, consequences for young people, education, etc., etc. That seems to now be baked into the report too, in the way that Baroness Hallett seems to think. It's that's issue one, everything's secondary. Whereas a wider public inquiry that wasn't sort of captured by this idea of how many lives could have been saved straight off, it's like making the same mistakes that the government made. So it's never going to get that full picture of how we could do things like that better.
And the report does say, doesn't it not, Michael, that at the end of COVID, when it was declared over in 2023, that actually the overall death tally wouldn't have been affected if we had lockdown sooner. So there is this question as well, also, I suppose, sort of really macro standing back. And it can sound almost quite harsh when you sort of say it, but, in 10, 20, 50 years' time, I mean, maybe the damage caused by turning the economy off and then turning it back on will outweigh the kind of...
Yeah, and we're living through that now, and we won't know that for years, for potentially decades to come. It'll be a matter of history.
Final question, Isabel. I mean, this report's come out. Some of the key actors have left the scene. What, if any, political ramifications do you think there will be in Westminster as a result of this?
Oh, it's such a good question, isn't it? Because I think the first thing that Keir Starmer can do is talk about all the people in it who've left the stage. And then, as I said, comes the business of working out what they want to implement. He has said that he is going to take some months to consider what she's said. Now, the way in which a government has to respond to an inquiry is basically they have to acknowledge that it existed. They don't have to accept its findings. They don't really have to go into detail about why they don't accept its findings either. And even if they do accept its findings, which often governments do, they say, this will never happen again. We accept all of these findings. And, they sit and have cosy chats with victims about how they're going to, do this in their mother's name, all the while knowing that either these policies are unworkable or they've got a load of other things that they care about more that they're not actually going to do. So the difference between acceptance and implementation is canyon-sized.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Michael. And thank you for listening to Coffee House Shots.